Dr. Deshan, thank you very much for being with us today. I might start with a quick introduction and then we can move into our questions. I am Aaron Green from Solbari, and we're really excited to be speaking to Deshan today about skin health, sun protection, and in particular how it pertains to the rural and agricultural community. Dr. Deshan Sebaratnam is a dermatologist currently working across Liverpool Hospital and the Children's Hospital Westmead in Sydney, as well as running a dermatology outreach clinic in Dubbo in rural New South Wales, Australia. After completing his medical degree at the University of New South Wales, he completed his residency at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, during which time he completed his Master of Medicine. He was awarded a scholarship in dermatology at the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania before selection into the specialist training program of the Australian College of Dermatologists. After successfully qualifying as a dermatologist, he completed his Sydney Children's Hospital's Network Pediatric Dermatology Fellowship across the Sydney Children's Hospital Network, Hostel Nino Jesus in Madrid, and UCSF, California. Dr. Sebaratnam also has a strong background in research, having multiple international peer-reviewed journal publications and having presented his research locally and internationally. He has a dedicated interest in teaching and serving rural and regional communities. So with that as background, Dr. Deshan, we're thrilled to have you to chat to us today about dermatology in rural and agricultural communities. Before we, with that incredible professional background, can you tell us a little more about yourself and what led you to becoming a dermatologist, your interest in dermatology?
So I was exposed to dermatology when I was a medical student. So dermatology is one of those specialties where you don't actually get that much structured teaching in medical school, but I was fortunate to get a little bit of that in my senior years. And the thing that I really like about dermatology is that it's a nice mix of medicine as well as surgery. You get to see patients at all stages of life. So, I see little kids with birthmarks, I see children with eczema, teens with acne, and then adults with all manner of medical troubles, including skin cancer. So it's nice because every patient's a little bit different and every day is a little bit different as well.
Fantastic. And what I found really interesting about you was, the split life between your time in Sydney and your time in Dubbo in rural New South Wales. What led you to want to have this presence in New South Wales? Sorry, in Dubbo. I understand you're a Sydney boy originally, so the interest in Dubbo, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's right. So, I spent essentially all of my life in Sydney. One of the initiatives that the government is doing, which I think is a great initiative, is encouraging doctors to spend a little bit of time in the country during their training. I'm in Sydney, my whole life's in Sydney, all my family, all my friends. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't have thought about working in the country had I not had that exposure and a good experience as a junior doctor. So having that exposure, seeing the breadth and scope of practice, that really encouraged me to then pursue some time in the country when I finished up all of my specialty training.
Yeah, great. And where is Dubbo? What is your day? What does your day look like? What does your life in Dubbo look like?
So with Dubbo, it's a really interesting practice. So we're the only dermatologist for hundreds of kilometers away.
Oh, wow.
And so I think west from us, the nearest dermatologist is Perth or something like that.
Oh, wow.
So we get patients who travel from, Lightning Ridge to come to Dubbo. We get patients from miles and miles around. So so a dermatologist is a specialist in diseases of skin, hair, or nails. So anyone with any kind of skin, nail, or health issue, if it's serious enough to need a specialist, will end up in that clinic.
Okay.
And so obviously working in the country, there's a lot of skin cancer. So a lot of what I do is surgical management, but then there's also such a giant need for medical dermatology and pediatric dermatology as well. So if you think about things like eczema or psoriasis, acne, all of those things kind of fall under the umbrella of dermatology. So it's nice because every day is a little bit different and every patient's a little bit different as well.
Okay. And I mean, with this variation, I imagine it's difficult to answer this next question, but your typical day in Dubbo, how does that differ from your typical day in Sydney?
So there's a few things that I think are different. So one, there's much more surgery. So patients will come in for their full skin checks, and more often than not, we will find a skin cancer as part of that screening. The other thing is that, it's universal, not just to see a specialist, but any kind of medical healthcare, there are barriers to accessing healthcare in the country. So often we see patients presenting later, and that can be because of long wait lists, that can be because of the distance, that can be because, the hours that you spend seeing your doctor are not hours that you're working on the land. And so there are barriers to accessing healthcare. So we see a few more later presentations in the country as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I think what I'd love to spend a bunch of this interview talking about is the issue specific to the rural and regional community. But before we, I guess, unpack that a little further, what's similar? What makes your patients in Dubbo similar to the patients that you have in Sydney or anywhere else, I suppose?
I guess we're still very blessed in Australia. Everything's still kind of universal healthcare, in that we can access all of the same medications, and the management of most things, I'm pretty lucky, is pretty similar whether you're in the city or in the country. There are a few interventions which are harder to access, things like radiotherapy for more advanced skin cancers. Often some of the more niche medications that are prescribed as a specialist might need to get ordered in. But by and large, the management of a lot of things is pretty similar.
Okay, so once they finally get to see you, even if they come all the way from Lightning Ridge, they get a pretty similar standard of care as if they saw you in Liverpool Hospital, which is encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then I guess coming back to the specific issues for rural and regional communities, are there particular dermatological issues that the rural and ag community need to have a greater awareness of?
So I think skin cancer is a major one. So we're lucky in Australia. We had one of the most successful public health campaigns through the 70s and 80s. So I grew up with slip, slop, slap, no hat, no play. All of that's pretty, I think I'd like to think standard for anyone kind of my age. But there's still a generation before that who didn't grow up with the information about slip, slop, slap. And who, talk about how many blistering sunburns they got when they were a kid. So there's a little bit of a delay with all those sunburns before they declare themselves as cancers, decades down the line. So often it's the sins of your youth that come back to haunt you a little bit later. And I think particularly in the country, there's a more predominant Caucasian population compared to the city, for example, and a lot more people have a much more outdoor lifestyle. And so that combination of white skin and lots of sun exposure is the perfect storm for skin cancer.
Okay. Yeah, look, I mean, that's definitely the impression we as lay people have, that of all the dermatological issues in the country, skin cancer is kind of the big glaring one. So yeah, I'd love to talk a lot about the broader dermatological issues, but I think let's certainly make sure we address a lot of the skin cancer concerns and issues as we talk through our questions. And I think that leads me on to the next point around prevention and sun protection. I guess primarily with skin cancer, but also other skin issues. How important is prevention for these issues? I guess particularly for skin cancer.
Yeah, so prevention plays a major role. And I guess that's one of the nice things as Australians, we're kind of leaders internationally in terms of skin cancer management. And like I said, strategies around prevention as well. So in terms of prevention, I mean, it's slip, stop, slap. We've all heard that a million times before. So wearing sun protective clothing, so long sleeves, hats, and wearing sunglasses, and then sunscreen as well. So all of those things have a major role to play, avoiding the sun during the peak of the day when that's possible as well. The other thing is in terms of prevention, being kind of taking a more proactive approach to things like skin cancer screening. Or picking up skin cancers, because we know that if we pick up skin cancers earlier, that leads generally to much better outcomes for patients as well.
Yeah, great. Look, I definitely want to spend some time talking about detection and management, but staying with prevention for the moment. I think, particularly as we talk about the agricultural community, the guidance to sort of stay out of the sun in the middle of the day when the sun is hottest isn't always possible. And so you've run through a few there, the best ways to for farmers and members of the rural community to stay protected. And it really is kind of summarized in that slip, slop, slap. So sunscreen as often as you can, well, as often as you ought, the long sleeve clothing, and the hat. And beyond skin cancer, are there other reasons why we should be staying protected in the sun, or why the rural and agricultural community should be adopting these methods in the sun? Are there other things that the sun can do to your skin?
Yes, there's a lot of other diseases that can be provoked by the sun. So the thing that we see, or I guess there's a lot of inflammatory conditions that can be made worse by the sun. So you mentioned lupus before, that's one example. There's lots of other conditions where inflammation within the skin can be provoked by the sun. And then the other thing is we know that sunlight or ultraviolet radiation can contribute to things like wrinkles and aging. So that's another reason to be a little bit better with your sun protection, to keep you looking pretty.
That's helpful. So to prevent skin cancer, but for a whole host of reasons, we should be staying protected in the sun.
Absolutely.
And look, we as Solwari know very well the importance of sun protective clothing. But from your perspective, can you give us a sense of UPF clothing and how that factors into sun protection?
So UPF is a measure relating to the sun protection offered by clothing, as you said. So people are pretty familiar with SPF. That's the measure that we use when we're talking about how much protection a sunscreen will offer. So UPF refers to how much protection a particular clothing will offer. So for example, if something is UP50, that means you get about 1/50th, so 1/50, of the sun damage that you would if you weren't wearing that. So in, 1/50th, 2%, about 90th% improvement.
Fantastic. So pretty important to be wearing it. And is this something that's generally understood by your community in terms of how sun protective clothing differs from non-sun protective clothing, or how different fabrics protect from the sun?
Not really. So I think a lot of people would think of a shirt as a shirt. Um, but actually there's a big difference in terms of how clothing is made up, in terms of how much ultraviolet it can let through. So, if you have a pretty thin, cotton shirt, if you put it up to the sun, you can actually see the sun poking through the holes. So if you can see the sun poking through the holes, that's visible light. That also means that other wavelengths like ultraviolet light, which we know contribute to skin cancer, that recognize carcinogens, are also getting through. So ideally, a simple test would be if you have something like denim, for example, it doesn't let light through. So that's pretty good sun protection. But certainly not every item of clothing is the same. So I think that's something that people aren't actually so aware of compared to things like, the importance of sunscreen.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. That's a very clear explanation of the importance of UPF 50, and I think it's my role here to do the Solbari plug, and to say that the benefit of the Solbari brand is that all of our products are designed and tested here in Australia and rated UPF 50 by our Panzer. So you don't need to be wearing something as thick as denim if you are wearing something as lightweight and accessible, but still UPF 50 like Solbari's clothes.
Because I think that's another good point. It's very easy for me to sit here at a desk and say, wear sunscreen, reapply it every 2 to 4 hours. But if you're working on the land, you're in the sun, you can't necessarily avoid the midday sun. And if you're working out, a lot of farmers will tell me sunscreen gets on my clothes. Sorry, not on my clothes, on my hands. I get dirt all over me. It sticks to me. If my hands are greasy, then I can't work the machinery like I need to. So I think in that respect, clothing is also a little bit easier in terms of convenience, because once you've got your shirt on, it does a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think that leads neatly into my last question around distinguishing between hats and sunscreen and clothing. We talked a lot about slip, slop, that, and obviously it's great to have all of them. But one of the questions we often hear from particularly people in the agricultural community, if I'm wearing sunscreen, do I still need to wear a hat? If I'm wearing a hat, do I still need to wear sunscreen? If I'm wearing UPF clothing, does it matter if I'm wearing a hat? How do you think about the trade-offs and the importance of wearing these things concurrently?
So I mean, the way I think about it, they're all elements of your armor that protects you from the sun, So you want to be wearing your your helmet as well as your breastplate before you go out to battle. And it's a similar kind of concept to me with sunscreen, hats, UPF 50 plus clothing. They all work in harmony with each other and they all offer different amounts of protection. And you want to do everything you can to minimize that sun damage. So I think they all work in harmony. One doesn't necessarily replace the other.
Okay. Before we move to detection, do you have any sort of stories or experiences with farmers where, yeah, I think things have changed in their lives or in their experience that have prompted them to take a different approach to sun protection?
So I think the thing that I found the most motivating is having a family member or a friend who's been affected by skin cancer. So we all like to think of ourselves, I guess, as, invincible. But then when you see it happening to someone who you're close to and how, it affects their life, I think that's a very strong motivating factor. Because I think it happens to your peer group, generally you have shared life experiences. So those sunburns that you got when you were younger, you weren't getting sunburnt by yourself. You were playing cricket out in the yard or, going to the beach or swimming with your friends. So I think that's one thing that I've really seen motivating people to be a little bit more proactive. Because when people think of skin cancer, I mean, one part is obviously that some skin cancers can be deadly. But the other part is living with the side effects of skin cancer that's spread. So having to live with scars or surgery or the complications of chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Yeah, there's not just skin cancer is a very broad church.
And there's always the uncertainty of, will it come back? And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, even in my life, I've had experience like my father who had a Merkel cell carcinoma, and there was just never any idea as to will it come back, won't it come back. Thankfully, he's now had 10 years of free PET scans, but there's sort of always this element of unknown, which once you've got it, it's always there. And look, I think we've had a very similar experience in this industry. We're very blessed to be able to sort of help as many people as we can preventing this. But being in this space, we come across day in, day out people that come to us because they've had an experience with skin cancer. And so that's, makes this all very real to us. So I guess moving beyond prevention and into detection, you started to allude before how important early detection is. So particularly with skin cancer, but also other issues. How could you give us a bit more of an idea about how important detection is, and also how these issues are typically detected? So you mentioned skin checks, but could you walk us through the different ways these things invariably pop up, or how people can get out ahead of it?
So with melanoma, for instance, we know that if we pick it up in its early stages, if you pick up a stage 1 melanoma, the cure rate's something like 90%. But that goes down as this melanoma advances. So picking things up like skin cancer early obviously has a big impact in terms of prognosis, but also treatment options. So being diligent with knowing your body, knowing your skin as well, is something that's really important, knowing where your moles are and what they look like. But then also as part of, your regular, maybe once a year visit with your GP, getting checked from top to toe. And if there's anything that your GP is worried about, seeing a dermatologist is a sensible way forward.
Great. And look, another plug here for Solbari products. If you go on the Solbari website, you can use the Skin Check app, which is an AI-powered app to help you track the moles on your body. And I think, look, it increases, as you were saying, just familiarity with the moles on your body, and helps you kind of stay in touch with your body, which is a great thing. And so that's in terms of how to detect issues. If unfortunately you are diagnosed with a melanoma or some other form of skin cancer, what are the treatment and management options, particularly for the rural and ag community?
So there's lots of different components of the skin, and each of those can become cancerous. So when people talk about skin cancer, I mean, melanoma comes to mind. The other common types of skin cancer are basal cell carcinoma, or BCC, and squamous cell carcinoma, or SCC. But then if you think about your skin, it's made up of hair, it's made up of muscles, it's made up of blood vessels. Any of those components can also turn cancerous as well. So skin is a broad church, and then
So your
within
hair
that,
can turn, sorry, your hair can turn cancerous.
not your hair per se, but your hair shafts can turn
Okay.
cancerous. So your
Oh, wow.
hair's dead, but the roots of it, you can certainly get cancers from there.
Well, that's very scary.
Um, and so, in terms of how you treat these, so different cancers also have different treatments. And I think that's one of the nice things about being a dermatologist. Um, I know the medical treatments, but I also know the surgical treatments. So,
Mm-hmm.
certainly cutting things out with surgery is one option. But there are certain creams that we use in particular scenarios. We have light activated creams. For patients with more advanced disease, they might need radiotherapy or surgery, or to participate in a multidisciplinary team where you have the opinion of multiple different doctors. So there's no one size rule kind of that fits every single type of skin cancer. And then even with a particular type of skin cancer, how you manage it in a 22-year-old might be different to a 92-year-old. Or if the exact same lesion was on the tip of the nose compared to your back, management can vary quite a bit.
Okay. And does that management typically differ between a 22-year-old in Dubbo and a 22-year-old in Sydney? Or, as you were saying before, universal healthcare, and thankfully we had pretty similar access.
Yeah, so I think the vast majority of the time it would be similar. There are some super specialized treatments that aren't so easy to get to in Dubbo. I mean, again, I'm a little bit spoiled because Dubbo isn't so far away from metropolitan Sydney. So
Mm-hmm.
if push comes to shove, you can access patients that are happy to drive to get those treatments.
Mm.
But for the vast majority of cases, it will be comparable.
Mm. Although I do suppose with particularly the agricultural community, every day, going through treatment is a day off the land,
Yeah,
and I'm sure you see guys, men and women who have driven for many hours just to be in Dubbo.
yeah.
So I imagine that not from a medical perspective, but just from sort of a social and life perspective, overlays another element of complexity, which makes it all the more important to prevent and detect early any issues so that treatment options are expanded.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. And then I guess moving to, I guess, get a broader perspective on dermatology and your research interests, I wanted to use the opportunity of having you with such a broad set of research interests to get get an update on what's interesting you at the moment, what your particular area of interest in dermatology are, and if there's anything happening at kind of the forefront of that space that you'd be interested in sharing with our community.
Yeah, so I think one of my particular areas of interest is in pediatric dermatology.
Mhm.
And it's kind of an exciting time to be a pediatric dermatologist because our knowledge of a lot of genetic conditions, for instance, has advanced rapidly.
Mhm.
So genetic tests are becoming more and more rapidly available. We
Mhm.
knew the genome sequence of coronavirus within a matter of weeks. And it's becoming, I mean, the number of applications is becoming increasingly, it's increasing exponentially.
Yeah.
So for a long time, there were lots of conditions which we would kind of describe based on what they look at or look like rather. But now we're able to work out the molecular signatures for a lot of these diseases, which is, a really exciting time. And for so long, not just with pediatric conditions, but things like psoriasis or eczema, we had a certain amount of treatments available, but now, I mean, there's new medications coming out all the time. Um, so yeah, there's lots of advances in medical dermatology in particular, but surgical dermatology as well. So there's new ways of testing for things like melanoma that are on the forefront. Artificial intelligence is going to potentially play more of a role in the future. So just like Facebook can kind of look at a picture of someone's face and recognize, oh, that's Aaron Green.
Mhm.
Potentially in the future, it can look at a picture of a mole and say, oh, that's a melanoma, or oh, that's a harmless mole. So it's an exciting time.
That's very exciting. And then so pediatric dermatology, which is skin issues with children and teenagers, I suppose.
Mhm.
What kind of skin issues do they face? And with all of these advances in different treatment methods and different ways of understanding the diseases, what yeah, what kind of what advances and what resolutions are we now seeing happen differently?
Yeah, so going back to the example about genetic changes, for instance,
Mm.
so we can, for some conditions, work out what the genetic problem is. Um, when you have a genetic problem, it means that your body is not coding for a particular protein, for example. And so there are ways now of replacing that protein to help, again, if you pick these things up early and you can supplement that protein, you can prevent problems down the line. So that's very exciting. And so going back to how many different structures and how complex the skin is. So when people think of a birthmark, most people will think of a dark spot, which is where you have too many pigment cells. But in the same way, you can have too many blood vessels, you can have too much collagen fibers. And so now some of the medical treatments, we're getting newer drugs for some of these birthmarks, which is very exciting. And then also things like laser treatments really advanced. So that's one of my other areas of interest. And so, treatments for some conditions, even 10 or 20 years ago, completely different to how we manage them now. So it's kind of nice. I'm quite fortunate in that I really enjoy dermatology. I enjoy my specialty. So for me, reading medical journals is like, reading Harry Potter. Like I actually do it for fun.
Yeah,
Um,
wow. Well, I can see it. Just, yeah, I think your passion certainly comes across over Zoom. So that's yeah, it's really exciting to be in the sort of skin health community and have someone like you, yeah, leading the charge. So you mentioned the birthmarks. Is that a cosmetic thing, or is there a medical reason someone might want to reduce the birthmark?
Yeah, good question. So sometimes birthmarks are just, a visible change and there's not too much to them, but actually some birthmarks are a clue to an internal problem. So, um, as a dermatologist, that's one of the things where I can see a birthmark and then that's a clue to a problem to the kidneys or to the liver or to the brain or to the
Mm.
heart. Um, and so I guess that's one area where being at Dubbo, we're a little bit far away from a tertiary pediatric hospital. We're pretty lucky in that we've got Dubbo base, which is great. But compared to, say, for instance, at Westmead Kids or Sydney Kids, slightly different services available. So in in Sydney, it's a little bit easier to assemble our multidisciplinary team. We're kind of like the Avengers. Each of us are good at one particular thing.
Mhm.
Whereas in Dubbo, that's one thing which is a little bit harder. And I mean, again, I'm kind of lucky in that I have Dubbo base just, around the corner. I have a big tertiary hospital, but that's not true of every dermatologist working in the country either. So lots of other dermatologists kind of dotted around rural New South Wales where they don't have access to a big tertiary hospital.
Okay. I mean, that was an interesting point on birthmarks. So if you've got a kid with a birthmark, is it not to be alarmist here, but is it worth kind of just asking your GP, hey, is this something
Yeah,
worth taking a look
yeah,
at?
definitely. So, I have a few birthmarks. Most birthmarks are nothing to worry about, but sometimes they can be a clue to something else. So that's why whenever you have a baby, the baby gets checked from top to toe as part of the baby check. And you have
Hmm.
the blue book and all of that documented for the first few visits. Because one of the other funny things about a birthmark is even though the name is a birthmark, it's a bit of a misnomer because sometimes the change is there from birth, but it doesn't declare itself until much later on in life.
Interesting. I
Yeah.
knew that. Okay. I mean, bringing the conversation back a little to the rural and agricultural setting, we've been talking about a lot of different dermatological issues, and both you and I, because of our professions, are quite interested and involved in that area. But for the general community, particularly in the rural and ag setting, how have you felt that awareness of these dermatological issues have developed over time? Is this skin cancer and psoriasis, eczema, all the issues that you've touched on? Is this something generally well understood? Has this been increasing, decreasing? Yeah, how do you feel about sort of general awareness of dermatological issues, in particularly in the
So
rural and ag community?
so I think it is increasing, and as time goes by, everyone will have a friend who's had something done. Two
Sure.
out of three Australians will have some form of skin cancer by the time they reach retirement age. So once you start to get to, 50s or 60s, someone in your friendship circle or family circle would have had a skin cancer, and then they'll share their experience with you. So
Mm.
I think awareness kind of improves as time goes by. But then the other thing is that we're kind of fortunate now with the internet. Even if you're in the country, you still have access to all the information in the universe in your pocket. But I think awareness is improving. And again, as my generation comes through, having lived slip, slop, slap, hopefully that will then affect the next generation of Australians. I think now, whenever I go to the pool or the beach, I see everyone in rashies rather than, normal togs. So hopefully, all of these things will, yield dividends later on.
Great. And look, we're really excited to be having this conversation so that we can also play a small part in getting the message out around important dermatological issues, particularly in communities that need to hear them. And I mean, beyond obviously the shameless plug as to what we're doing, is there any other exciting work being done to build awareness or sort of to drive consensus? Obviously, there was great work done in the 80s and 90s, as you mentioned, with the Slip Slap campaign. Is there other work being done to raise awareness around dermatological issues in the rural and ag community?
Yeah, so I don't know specifically to the rural and ag community, but each spring the government will reinvent that message about skin cancer safety. So nothing safe about a tan or dark side of tanning. Each year the program kind of gets rejigged a little bit. In the country, I think there's hopefully a little bit more of an emphasis on primary prevention. And then in terms of, because there is a national shortage of dermatologists, one other kind of step in between is things like skin cancer clinics. So the doctors who work at skin cancer clinics aren't specialists, they're GPs, but they've got a particular interest in skin cancer. So I think that's also a nice way of, potentially bridging the gap for the cases that aren't too complex as well.
Very exciting. Now, I'd like to end. We reached out to our farming community members through our partners at New South Wales Farmers, and we got a few questions from farmers. Hopefully, they're not too complicated. Maybe some of them you've heard before. I might shoot a few at you if you're open to
Yeah,
answering
of
them.
course.
So the first one is, what's the difference between a freckle and a mole? Why is one blemish a freckle and the one right beside it classed as a mole?
Yeah, good question. So in our skin, we have our pigment cells. So there are melanocytes. And if something is a freckle, it means that the pigment cells are a bit more active and they're producing a bit too much or a bit more of the pigment. So actually, you and me, even though our skin colors are very different, we have the exact same number of pigment cells. It's just my pigment cells produce a lot more color than yours.
Okay, interesting.
So with a
Sorry,
freckle,
melanocytes, is that just another fancy name for pigment?
that's the fancy name for pigment cells.
Okay.
So melanocytes are the pigment cells, and what they produce is melanin, which is the pigment.
Okay, interesting.
So with a freckle, it is the normal number of melanocytes or pigment cells, but they're just producing extra amounts of pigments.
Okay.
Whereas with a mole, or its fancy word is a nevus, it's where you have too many melanocytes all together in one little group. So even though both of them will look brown, different processes going on. One of the tools that I use as a dermatologist is something called a dermatoscope. So with the dermatoscope, you can see that there's a light, and it's a special kind of light called polarized light, but it's also magnification. So when I look at a particular spot, I get clues on a microscopic level about the structures that are forming it. And so that's something which is helpful in terms of picking up skin cancers earlier on, because rather than waiting for a change that I can see with my eye, I can find a microscopic change. But the other thing is sometimes a mole will look a little, or a brown spot will look, or any spot can look a little bit suspicious. But then when I look at it with the dermatoscope, if I see something that's reassuring, then I can save the patient having extra tests done.
Great. So it's worth getting an expert opinion, even if you're a little concerned, because it might give you that peace of mind.
Yeah.
Great. And then the next one I have is also on freckles and moles. And the question is, if it's not exposed to the sun, is it likely to ever need checking?
Yeah, very good question. So we know that with some forms of skin cancers, well, with most forms of skin cancer, sunlight has a major role to play. But you can actually get a skin cancer anywhere where you have skin. So I have picked up melanomas on people's bottoms. You can get a melanoma in the back of your eye. You can get a melanoma on your scrotum or your penis or your vagina, even if it's never, seen the light of day. So Bob Marley was my skin color, but he actually died of a melanoma on the bottom of his toe.
Wow.
So it's not impossible. It's much less likely. It tends to be in areas which get lots and lots of sun. But the thought process is that, you'll get a sunburn on your hand that will send distress signals all over the body, and they can be picked up anywhere. That's one part, but the other part is that not every single skin cancer is caused by the sun. So we were talking before about some medical conditions like lupus, for example. Particular inflammatory conditions can also cause or mutations in the skin, which can then predispose to skin cancer.
Okay, so moles can require checking even if they've never seen the sun. Very
Yeah.
good. Thank you. And on the back of the eye, is there skin there? How's that?
There's not skin there, but there's pigment there.
Okay.
So inside your eyeball is actually completely black and it absorbs light. So it's not impossible, but yeah, you can get melanoma at the back of the eye, but also in the front of the eye as well.
Fascinating. Okay. Well, all the more important to get checked. And then the final question I have from farmers is, does skin get more sensitive to the sun as you age? I tend to feel the sun a lot more now than I did in my 20s.
So as time goes by, with lots of sun exposure, you do get a little bit of damage to the structures of the skin. So the elastic fibers within the skin break down. You can get things like dilated pores, and as the supporting structures around the skin kind of weaken, then other things can lose their shape as well. So, your blood vessels can become a little bit more dilated. So a lot of people get broken blood vessels as a marker of sun damage. And so with that, you can then feel a little bit more hot or flushed in the sun. So again, these are all good reasons why you should be good with your sun protection, your hats, your sunscreen, your UPF 50 plus clothing. It helps keep away some of the signs of aging as well.
Fantastic. Deshan, I've had a great time speaking with you today. Before we sign off, we've been speaking a lot about sun protection, skin issues, in particular, how they pertain to the rural and agricultural community. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you think is important to get out there?
No, I think we've covered lots of good ground, but I mean, I guess the take-home message is if there's anything you're worried about in terms of skin, hair, or nails, the specialist to see is someone with, a dermatologist. And the way you can tell someone's a specialist, they'll have the letters FACD behind their name, and that way you know they've satisfied all of the Australian requirements to be a specialist.
Fantastic. And I think an important shout out if you're in the Dubbo area or the
Ah,
Liverpool Hospital area, find Dr. Deshan Sebaratnam.